Let's talk about the role of specificity in CSS syntax. In CSS, specificity is a quality that can be measured and determined based on how specific the selector is, meaning how many elements could match. So we have discussed how the selector is our target, meaning what we write as the selector in our CSS determines which elements are affected by the properties and values in the declaration box. We have also gone over how the general name of an element can be a selector, like header1 or h1. In terms of specificity, element selectors have a low specificity. For example, when we call an h1 selector in our CSS, we aren't being specific which h1 we want to affect. We're styling all of them at once. So this means that we're defining generally and we're not being really specific which h1 we're actually defining. This is true for all element selectors. The purpose of a class is to create a label for a group of elements. For example, in a class selector, we would want to label multiple things, a general group of things that we want to style. This means that class selectors have a greater specificity than element selectors. We're not just saying, hey, change all of the header ones. We're saying, hey, change this specific group of objects and elements in our code. So when we use an ID in our CSS, we're trying to target a super specific object. For best practice in CSS, you only want to give one object an ID in your whole code, right? So this means that ID selectors have a higher specificity than class selectors and element selectors, because whatever contains an ID in your HTML and CSS only exists once. When we're defining the properties and values for an ID in our code, we are targeting one thing, which means we're being super specific. We're only targeting one thing. So something that we haven't discussed is how we can combine class selectors, ID selectors, and element selectors to create more complicated levels of specificity. I'll show you guys examples so this can be a little bit more clear. So we can make a selector contain more than one class, right? We can combine two classes to be super specific. So our selector can contain and define a class and ID simultaneously. This means that we can say that if our element or object belongs in a class or is part of a class and is also this specific object, this would be one way that we could target that specific element. Our selector can also contain a class and an element selector. So what we haven't talked about really is how this little A in our CSS or HTML, A stands for link. So let's say that we want all of our links to be a certain way in a class, if it belongs to a class. This would be one way that we can target it. We can also define and combine a ID with an element selector, so we can be super specific that and say, hey, if this super ID has a link inside of it, we always want this link to be this particular color. And what's also cool is that our selector can even contain and combine a class, ID, and element selector for like this super complicated and specific element. I'm going to show you guys how this all works in Mozilla Thimble so you can see for yourself how specificity affects our HTML.